Grace Kelly's father called her a loser, told her she'd never amount to anything. And she won an Oscar, married a prince, became royalty. And the question nobody has ever answered is whether her dad ever actually told her he was proud. That question has haunted every biography, every retrospective, every late-night conversation anyone's ever had about Grace Kelly. And it haunted her, too. Because everything she built, the career, the crown, the fairy tale that 30 million people watched on television, all of it traces back to a house in Philadelphia and a man who couldn't say the one thing his daughter needed to hear. The house still stands, 3901 Henry Avenue, East Falls, Philadelphia. A handsome Georgian colonial set back from the street with the quiet authority of a family that believed it had earned every inch of that lawn. East Falls in the 1930s and 40s was Irish Catholic to its bones. Parish boundaries mattered more than zip codes. Your family name was your credit score. And the Kellys weren't just residents. They were the neighborhood's most prominent family. Local royalty before Grace became actual royalty. The kind of clan whose reputation preceded them in every church pew, every polling station, every rowing club along Boathouse Row on the Schuylkill River. And the man who built that reputation was John Brendan Kelly Sr. Jack, born October 4th, 1889, the son of Irish immigrants from County Mayo, who arrived in America carrying nothing but the immigrants' twin fuels, shame and ambition. Jack apprenticed as a bricklayer as a young man, working with his hands in the same trade that would later be used against him, and he built Kelly for Brickwork into one of the largest and most successful construction firms on the Eastern Seaboard. His company's projects became Philadelphia landmarks, buildings and structures that still stand across the city, monuments to a man who believed that what you made with your hands was the only honest measure of your worth. He was deeply embedded in the civic life of East Falls and Greater Philadelphia. Democratic politics, the Penn Athletic Club, Catholic institutions. He ran for mayor of Philadelphia in 1935 as a Democrat and lost. A rejection that stung him more than he'd ever let on to anyone outside the family. Jack Kelly could shake every hand in East Falls. He was gregarious, charismatic, genuinely generous with his time and money, beloved in the neighborhood, the kind of father every neighbor assumed was wonderful. But bricklaying was the second most important thing Jack Kelly ever did with his body. The first was rowing. At the 1920 Summer Olympics in Antwerp, Jack Kelly won 2 gold medals, one in the single sculls and another in the double sculls, alongside his cousin, Paul Costello. Think about the physical reality of that for a moment. 2 separate races at the same Olympic Games, one of them entirely alone in a boat, powering through the water against the best single scullers on Earth, and winning. 4 years later in Paris, he and Costello won gold again in the doubles. 3 Olympic golds. Jack Kelly was a national hero, a face of American athletic dominance, a man whose body had been tested against every rival on every course that mattered and found superior. He walked into rooms, and the rooms rearranged themselves around him. That kind of physical supremacy does something to a person's psychology. It teaches you that the world is a contest, that strength is the only currency that doesn't depreciate, and that anything you can't time with a stopwatch or weigh on a scale probably isn't real. Every course that mattered. Except one. In 1920, the same year he won Olympic gold, Jack Kelly had applied to compete in the Diamond Challenge Sculls at England's Henley Royal Regatta, the most prestigious single sculling event in the world, the one title that would have completed the set. They rejected him. The official grounds rested on Henley's then-standing rule that barred anyone who was, by trade or employment for wages, a mechanic, artisan, or laborer. Jack Kelly, bricklayer. Too common for their waters, too rough-handed for the gentleman's course. And there's long been credible speculation that anti-Irish Catholic prejudice sharpened the blade, that the English rowing establishment simply didn't want an Irish-American laborer's son beating their gentleman on their own river. Jack never forgot it, not for a single day of his life. According to family lore, after winning gold in Antwerp, he mailed his worn green rowing cap to King George V. Pure, defiant contempt wrapped in brown paper and postage. Historians have noted there's no record of the cap arriving, and the story may owe more to the Kelly family's talent for self-mythology than any postal receipt. But whether the cap was sent, or just claimed to have been sent, doesn't really matter. What matters is what the story reveals about the man. This was someone who organized his entire identity around answering a rejection. The Henley exclusion became the engine of everything, the chip on his shoulder that never dissolved, the furnace that forged his ambition, and, most consequentially, the template for how he'd raise his children. He would mold them into proof that the Kelly name was worthy, that no gatekeeper, no English aristocrat, no establishment of any kind could ever look down on his blood again. The problem was that Jack Kelly's definition of proof was extraordinarily narrow, physical, measurable. You could time a rowing race, you could weigh a brick, you could count the buildings your company built. What you couldn't do, in Jack Kelly's framework, was measure a performance on a stage. Acting was pretending, and pretending was the opposite of the Kelly creed, which was doing. And his second daughter would spend her entire life falling outside that definition. Grace Patricia Kelly was born November 12, 1929, third of 4 children. Older sister Margaret, called Peggy, born 1925. Brother John Brendan Kelly Jr., known to everyone as Kell, born 1927. Youngest sister Elizabeth Ann, called Liz Ann, 1933. The family hierarchy was established early and enforced without anyone needing to say it out loud. It was built into the architecture of daily life on Henry Avenue, the way load-bearing walls are built into a house. Kell was the heir, full stop, the son who'd carry Jack's athletic legacy, groomed from toddlerhood to row, destined to return to Henley and win the Diamond Challenge sculls on behalf of a father who'd been told he wasn't good enough. This wasn't a gentle hope. It was a mandate. Kell's entire childhood organized around fulfilling his father's unfinished business with the English rowing establishment. And Kell delivered. In 1947, he won the Diamond Challenge sculls at Henley, and biographers have noted it gave Jack Kelly more satisfaction than anything his other children ever accomplished. The vendetta was settled. The Kelly name had been redeemed on the waters where it had been rejected. Kell was the instrument of Jack's redemption, and that role cast a shadow over every other child in the house. Peggy, the eldest daughter, had the family's boisterous energy and physical confidence, and when she briefly pursued acting, at least she'd done it first. Novelty has its own small shield. Lisanne, the baby, had the baby's traditional immunity from expectation. Grace occupied the most dangerous position in the family architecture. She was the middle child, who was none of the things her father valued. Where the Kellys were loud, Grace was quiet. Where they were athletic and physically robust, Grace was sickly. Asthma, chronic colds, stretches confined indoors while her siblings raced and competed in the yard and down by the river. Where the Kelly family culture prized toughness, directness, and physical dominance, Grace was dreamy, sensitive, drawn to imaginative play, to dolls and stories and make-believe worlds that had no scoreboard and no finish line. Her mother, Margaret Mayer Kelly, was herself a formidable woman, a former cover model of German descent who'd been the first woman to coach women's physical education at the University of Pennsylvania. And she brought to the household the same emphasis on physical discipline and stoic performance that Jack demanded. Between the two of them, Emotional vulnerability was weakness. Artistic inclination was a charming irrelevance. Something you outgrew, like baby teeth. Grace later described her childhood in terms biographers have consistently noted for their quiet sadness. She was the overlooked one, the child who didn't fit. Not abused, not neglected in any material sense. The Kellys were prosperous. The house on Henry Avenue was comfortable, and she wanted for nothing that money could buy. She was simply unseen in the specific way that mattered most. Her father did not recognize her. Multiple biographies, Robert Lacey, Donald Spoto, Wendy Lee, Gwen Robbins, describe the same family system. Grace's ambitions treated as lightweight compared to Kell's trajectory. Jack openly regarding acting as frivolous. Not real work. Not a serious pursuit for a Kelly. When Grace announced she'd study at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, the family response ranged from tepid to openly skeptical. Biographers cite variations of a devastating family assessment, that Grace was the last of the Kelly children anyone expected to amount to anything. Some accounts describe Jack as having called her a loser, or at least expressing the sentiment so consistently that the word became the biographical shorthand for a much larger pattern of dismissal. Whether that exact word left his mouth or whether it's a biographer's distillation matters less than the emotional reality, which is consistent across every account. Jack Kelly looked at his 4 children and saw, in Grace, the one who didn't count. And here's the cruelty that makes this story rhyme with itself in the most painful way imaginable. A man who'd been told by the English establishment that he wasn't enough, that his hands were too rough, his origins too common, his blood too Irish, became a man who told his own daughter she wasn't enough. Jack Kelly knew exactly what it felt like to be rejected by gatekeepers. The Henley decision haunted him for decades, shaped his entire life's purpose. And yet, he replicated that exact wound for Grace, apparently without ever recognizing the parallel. The man denied approval who then denied it to his daughter. It's the oldest inheritance in the world, and it doesn't stop being devastating just because it's common. So Grace went to New York. She studied at the academy. She worked. She got cast. She moved through Hollywood with a luminous, controlled intelligence that directors couldn't stop reaching for. Within a few years, she'd gone from unknown to one of the most sought-after actresses in the industry. Her face on magazine covers, her name above the title, her performances carrying a quality of restrained emotional depth that felt almost revolutionary against the bigger, louder styles of the era. She wasn't performing, she was revealing. And that distinction, the difference between showing and being, is what made her extraordinary on screen. It's also what made her invisible at home, because her father couldn't see the difference. On the evening of March 30th, 1955, at the 27th Academy Awards, Grace Kelly won Best Actress for The Country Girl. She was 25 years old. She'd beaten out Judy Garland, who was the sentimental favorite. She'd reached the absolute pinnacle of her chosen profession, the highest honor her industry could bestow, the undeniable, objective proof that she was exceptional at the thing she'd given her life to. What did her father say? The biographical record provides an answer that's devastating for what it contains and for what it doesn't. According to Robert Lacey and other Kelly biographers, Jack's response to Grace's Oscar wasn't pride. It was something closer to bewildered deflection. The most frequently cited version, he said he'd always thought it would be Peggy, that if any of his daughters was going to succeed in acting, he would have expected the eldest, not Grace. One sentence, and it simultaneously acknowledges the achievement, denies Grace personal credit for it, redirects the spotlight to her sister, and reaffirms that Grace was never the one he had his eye on. It's the entire father wound compressed into a handful of words. I see what you did, and I'm still not looking at you. No documented phone call after the ceremony telling her he was proud. No letter biographers have ever uncovered. Just the deflection to Peggy, the family's general bemusement that their quiet, sickly middle child had somehow become the most famous woman in the world, and the silence where unconditional pride should have lived. Grace's own acceptance speech didn't single out her father in any particularly emotional way, which biographers have noted as potentially significant. Either she was protecting him, protecting herself, or both. The Oscar didn't close the gap. The audience of one didn't stand. Everything that happened next has to be understood in that light. Barely 2 months later, May 1955, Grace attended the Cannes Film Festival. A photo session arranged by Paris Match magazine paired her with Prince Rainier III of Monaco. It was manufactured. A movie star and a prince, the kind of pairing that sells magazines by the truckload. But something genuine took root that day. A correspondence began afterward. Letters crossing the Atlantic through the summer and fall of 1955, the prince of a Mediterranean principality and the girl from Henley Avenue finding something in each other's words that neither had expected. By December 1955, Rainier traveled to Philadelphia to visit Grace and meet the Kelly family. He came to the house on Henley Avenue, the same house where Grace had been the overlooked child, and sat in Jack Kelly's living room, a sovereign prince asking a Philadelphia bricklayer's son for his daughter's hand. Jack wasn't impressed. Biographers describe his reaction with remarkable consistency. He wasn't awed by European royalty. His frame of reference was American, Catholic, athletic, self-made, and a small Mediterranean principality didn't register on the scale of things Jack Kelly respected. There are accounts of him questioning whether Rainier was financially stable, with one famous reported quip suggesting he didn't want some broken-down prince looking for a rich American wife. Maybe that was humor, maybe protectiveness. Maybe it was Jack's reflexive need to dominate any room he entered, including a room that contained an actual prince. But it was also, yet again, a failure to recognize what his daughter had attracted. Grace Kelly, the child he'd written off, was being courted by royalty, and her father's instinct was to diminish the suitor rather than celebrate the daughter. The pattern held. It always held. Then came the detail that reframes the entire fairy tale. The dowry. The Grimaldi family required, per Monegasque tradition, and the financial realities of a principality whose treasury wasn't overflowing, that the bride's family pay a dowry reported at roughly $2 million. Jack Kelly wrote the check. The exact figure has been debated. Some sources place it at $2 million, others suggest it may have been somewhat less, but the order of magnitude is consistent across accounts, and the symbolic weight is staggering, regardless of the precise number. Jack Kelly literally financed his daughter's entrance into royalty. He gave her what may have been the most expensive gift any father in America had ever given a daughter. And still, giving money isn't the same as giving approval. A father can fund a fairy tale and withhold the single sentence that would have cost him nothing. The dowry bought a crown. It didn't buy the words Grace actually needed to hear. April 19, 1956. Monaco's Cathedral of Our Lady Immaculate. An estimated 30 million television viewers worldwide. One of the most watched events of the 20th century. Grace was 26. Rainier, 32. The entire Kelly clan had been transported from East Falls to the Mediterranean coast for a ceremony that united a Philadelphia bricklayer's granddaughter with 7 centuries of European aristocracy. Grace, in her Helen Rose gown, the cathedral gleaming white against the Mediterranean blue, the principality draped in flowers. The images from that day became the defining visual of a modern fairy tale, reproduced so many times they eventually stopped looking like photographs and started looking like mythology. And no camera captured, no microphone recorded, What Jack Kelly felt in that cathedral, watching his overlooked daughter become Her Serene Highness, the Princess of Monaco. Did he finally see her? Did the word proud cross his lips, even privately, even whispered to Margaret in the pew? The record doesn't tell us. What it tells us is that he attended, he participated, and no biographer has found evidence of a transformative emotional moment between father and daughter on what should have been the most validating day of Grace's life, a day watched by 30 million strangers. But the one set of eyes that mattered most? We simply don't know what they saw. Jack Kelly died on June 20th, 1960, 70 years old. Grace had been princess for 4 years. She'd given birth to Caroline on January 23, 1957, and Albert on March 14, 1958. Jack's grandchildren, heirs to a throne. He lived long enough to see his daughter become royalty, become a mother twice over, become an international figure whose stature eclipsed anything any Kelly had ever achieved. He didn't live to see Stephanie, born February 1, 1965. He didn't live to see the later years when Grace's unhappiness in Monaco would become harder to hide. 4 years. That was the window between the wedding and his death. Grace was in Monaco. Jack was in Philadelphia. The Atlantic Ocean separated them, and the emotional distance that had always existed between father and daughter was now compounded by geography, time zones, and the relentless protocol of royal life. Grace visited Philadelphia when she could. There were phone calls and letters, but biographers who have examined this period, who have interviewed family members and combed through correspondence, haven't found evidence that the fundamental dynamic between them shifted before he died. No deathbed letter, no recorded scene where Jack Kelly, facing the end, finally said what she needed to hear. This doesn't mean it never happened. Private moments between parents and children go unrecorded all the time, and the absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. But the weight of the biographical record, compiled across decades by multiple independent researchers, points in one direction. The question, did he ever tell her he was proud, has no definitive yes anywhere in the historical record. What it has is a pattern of deflection, a lifelong investment in the wrong child's dreams, a check for $2 million, and a silence that Grace carried for the rest of her life. And that silence shaped everything about how she lived inside the royal life she'd won. The price of that life was real, tangible. She gave up acting entirely. Her MGM contract was bought out as a condition of the marriage. She surrendered personal freedom and submitted to palace protocol that governed everything from what she wore, to where she went, to who she spoke with. She learned French. She navigated a culture and a court that weren't hers, where she was simultaneously the most famous woman in the room and a permanent outsider. She was isolated from American friends and family by an ocean and the demanding obligations of being a working princess. When she tried to go back, when discussions began about a project called Marnie, a chance to act again, the Monegasque public reacted so forcefully against the idea of their princess returning to Hollywood that Grace had to abandon it. That loss cut deep. She missed acting. She missed the work, the identity it gave her, the version of herself that existed on a film set where her talent was the thing people valued. Biographers have documented periods of genuine loneliness in Monaco, stretches of quiet depression, the slow erosion of the American identity she'd carried to Europe like luggage she was gradually forced to unpack and leave behind. The marriage had its strains, too. Biographers who handled this with care, and it deserves care, have documented periods of tension between Grace and Rainier. Not tabloid dramatics. The ordinary, grinding friction of two strong people from radically different worlds trying to build a life together under extraordinary public scrutiny. There were genuinely happy years. There was real love between them. Evidence supports this across many accounts. But there were also hard years, years of distance and difficulty that Grace bore with the same stoic composure the Kelly family had trained into her from the time she could walk. She'd learned early how to perform contentment. Monaco just gave her a bigger stage on which to do it. But here's what gets lost in the tragedy reading, and it shouldn't, because something extraordinary happened inside that royal life, something that both the people who loved the fairy tale and the people who saw through it might actually agree on. Grace Kelly became the mother she never had a father. She broke every royal parenting norm Monaco had ever known. In a palace culture built on nannies and protocol and carefully maintained emotional distance between parents and children, Grace insisted on being present. Physically, daily, stubbornly present. She bathed Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie herself. She put them to bed at night. She showed up at their school events. She read to them, held them, was affectionate with them in ways that reportedly startled the Monegasque court because it simply wasn't done. Not by princesses, not in those hallways, not in that tradition of child-rearing where royal children were raised by staff and presented to parents at scheduled intervals like dispatches from the nursery. Grace didn't care what Monaco expected. She cared about what her children felt. And the reason why is the part of this story that breaks your heart wide open. Because she wasn't just mothering. She was correcting. Every bath she drew, every bedtime story she read, every school play she attended was a deliberate act of opposition to the way she'd been raised. She was giving Caroline, Albert, and Stephanie the warmth Jack Kelly never gave her. The presence. The undivided attention. The uncomplicated, unconditional message. I see you, and what I see is enough. You don't have to win anything. You don't have to prove anything. You are enough because you exist. And I'm telling you that right now so you never have to wonder. Her children have spoken about what kind of mother she was. The picture they paint is of a woman who was deliberate about love in a way that only makes sense when you understand what its absence cost her. She couldn't fix her father. That window closed on June 20th, 1960, and whatever words were or weren't spoken between them, they'd never be enough to fill 30 years of silence from the house on Henry Avenue. But she could make sure her children never carried that silence, never had to win an Oscar or marry into royalty to feel seen by the person who mattered most. She couldn't heal the wound, so she broke the cycle instead. That's the real story of Grace Kelly. Not the films, not the gowns, not the fairy tale wedding watched by 30 million people, not even the crown. The real story is a woman who spent her whole life performing for an audience of one who never applauded, and who then turned around and applauded for her children every single day. Loudly, deliberately, with her whole self. The fairy tale was real. She did love Rainier. She did build something meaningful in Monaco, the Rose Ball, a mode and its work for children's welfare, a cultural legacy that the Principality still cherishes decades later. She was beloved by the Monegasque people, and that love was earned through years of genuine dedication to a country she'd adopted as her own. All of that is true. The admirers aren't wrong. And the tragedy was real too. The loneliness, the lost career, the freedoms she surrendered, the identity she slowly, quietly set down in a palace that never quite felt like home. The car accident on September 14th, 1982. A stroke behind the wheel on a winding mountain road above Monaco. Her daughter Stephanie beside her in the passenger seat. Grace dying the following day at 52 years old. Both things lived inside the same woman, every day. The beauty and the cost, the crown and the wound, the princess the world saw, and the girl from East Falls who just wanted her dad to say one sentence he apparently never said. The historical record, biographies, family interviews, correspondence, decades of research by people who devoted their professional lives to understanding Grace Kelly, contains no confirmed moment where Jack Kelly offered his daughter the unconditional pride she spent her entire life trying to earn. What it contains is a deflection to Peggy on Oscar night, a skepticism about the prince, a $2 million check written without the words that would have meant more than any amount of money, and a 4-year window between the royal wedding and his death that closed without the resolution Grace deserved. Maybe he said it in private. Maybe there's a moment that no biographer captured, no family member reported, no letter preserved. I hope so. Genuinely, deeply hope so. But the woman who bathed her own children in a palace full of nannies, who held them and showed up for them and made absolutely certain they never had to guess whether they were enough, that woman lived as though the words never came. She lived as though that silence was permanent, and she decided, with every choice she made as a mother, that her children would never know that particular quiet. That's the price Grace Kelly paid for royal life. Not just Hollywood, not just freedom, not just the career or the country or the identity she left behind. The price was a lifetime of performing for someone who never clapped, and the grace to make sure she clapped for everyone who came after her. Subscribe for more stories like this.